I'm Cliff Ribner, and I'm going to talk to you today about one of the most remarkable assets we have, which is literally being plundered by the federal government, or rather bureaucrats and all sorts of parasites who benefit from. And it's something the federal government was never, ever supposed to be involved in. And what I'm talking about is federal land ownership. The amount of land that the federal government owns is staggering. It's bigger than any country in Europe. It's bigger than any several countries in Europe. It's 28% of all the real estate in America, and that's including Alaska as part of America, which of course it is. That is a huge amount of land, and 28% is owned by the federal government. And it's owned for various purposes, but the real reason politicians have wanted the federal government to have it is because it becomes an asset of the politicians. Harry Reid was a classic example. Nevada is a state where 90% of the land is owned by the federal government. 90%. And what that means is politicians get to use that land and dish it out to their buddies in various ways, extracting all sorts of political favors. That's one of the ways Harry Reid stayed in office all those years. Completely corrupt. And the Constitution doesn't have anything in it about management of federal lands. The only federal lands that are, but it does specify a very specific place where the federal government was supposed to own land. And that's it. It was what's now Washington, D.C., and it describes in detail how they were going to take land from Maryland and Virginia and make Washington, D.C. And then the only other lands that the Constitution contemplates that the federal government would actually own, as opposed to individuals owning it. And I'll tell you why this is so important, are things like forts and military bases. That's what we have today. They didn't really have those in the 17th century or the 18th century, but it's the equivalent. But anyway, very modest amounts of land that were ever contemplated for the federal government. The idea was this is supposed to be a place where property exists, where property rights are respected, because when property rights are respected, the citizens get rich. And citizens can't get rich if property rights aren't respected. And when the federal government owns land, what that means is that land is removed from private ownership. Teddy Roosevelt, when he was president, one of the lunatic things he did was creating things like national monuments, national parks. It's an idea that sounds great in theory, but when you look at what actually happens, what it meant was taking land away from the ability of people to use it, taking land away from the control and ownership of private citizens, and instead putting it in the federal government, which means putting it under the thumb of politicians and bureaucrats. And that's what a big chunk of that 28% is. Now, we have these places that we love to go to as tourists, Sequoia, Yosemite, and they're very beautiful. And there's this notion that it has to be public land in order to preserve it that way. That's not true at all. One of the great inventions of the 20th century was the idea of what's called a scenic easement. A scenic easement is when land is made, it's owned privately, but the private owners have a duty under it's described in the deed, the nature of the easement. They have a duty to preserve its beauty in various ways. And it happens that this enhances their value because the land itself becomes worth something because of its beauty, and the guarantee of its continued beauty is preserved by that feature of the land ownership, so that all the lots in a whole area would have to be covered by this, easements of that nature. Anyway, for example, the federal government, first of all, let's remember, we're $37 trillion in debt. We are bankrupt if you disregard the actual assets that we have. And what this land has the potential to do is liberate us from that. It literally, if that land were sold, which is what should happen, and the proceeds of the sales were used to discharge the national debt, that would be by far the best use. Not only in terms of the current value of discharging the debt and the government receiving that money instead of taxing it from us, because in that case, the government is receiving money from people who are buying it. They're paying for real value. That property becomes something that's worth something in the hands of the citizens who have it. They can put it to real use. And for example, things like the Grand Canyon. We think of the Grand Canyon, oh, we have to keep the pristine beauty. Well, the owners of it, if real estate developers bought it, and they wanted to have housing developments there, they could do it so that it wouldn't harm the beauty at all. In fact, they would want to. They would have every incentive in the world. They don't need to have the government gun pointed at their head to preserve the beauty. It's their own property. The reality is nobody takes better care of property than the owner. And when property is controlled by the government, it's miserable. It's kept terribly. And one of the interesting things I decided to look at, AI is a great thing for certain purposes, making certain types of research much simpler. Because for example, finding out what the real numbers are of the Department of Interior, which basically controls all of that land. It's got all these things like the Forestry Bureau, and there's all these different sub-bureaus within it, but the Department of the Interior basically has all that land. They have a private army that they pay for, and the purpose of that private army is to keep citizens out of the land. So it's protecting it from us. That's what they do when they put it into public hands. They take it away from us, and nobody owns it, although the politicians and the bureaucrats continue to control it. In fact, they're the only ones who do. And it diminishes the wealth of the nation in numerous ways. First of all, you ought to see the numbers. There's a lot of timber on federal lands. But there's also timber on private lands. One of the interesting things is to look at the difference between the gross revenue, forget about net revenue, the gross revenue received by the federal government from its timberlands compared to the revenue, the net income received by private owners of timberlands. Private owners get anywhere from 5 to 10 times the amount per acre in profit from their timberlands because they know how to run it. And that's just one feature of timberlands. All those fires that take place every year, they act as if this is some inevitable thing. It's an act of God. It's nothing of the kind. And the politicians who want you to keep thinking stuff like that are the ones who blame it on climate change. They think, oh, climate change is doing this. No, that's not what's causing the fire. What's causing it is very poor forestry management. The climate isn't changing any more on public lands than it is on private lands. And there's millions more acres of private timberland than public timberland. And there's never any fires on the private timberland. It's got the same climate that's changing as on the public lands. So we know that climate change has absolutely nothing to do with it. It has to do with incompetent forestry management. Because when the government controls things, the way it controls, there's always a political element to how it does the control. And in the case of public lands, they've got environmentalists have gotten control of the way we manage our public lands in this country. And they don't want any real forestry management. They want to let the fires burn. They don't tell people this, but that's the reality. So what they've done, for example, in California, the lands of California there were always fires. It was always fires before the millions of people moved in there, beginning really in the 1840s. And the Santa Ana winds guarantee that there's going to be fires if the land is not managed in a certain way and if water is not available in a certain way. And they learned how to do that. They eliminated the fires basically during the 20th century by brilliant forestry management and by knowing what they were doing. All of that was the environmentalists insist all of that go away. For example, the lunatic governor of California, he's been blowing up dams. Yes, he's been blowing up dams to save fish, he claims. It's really just to do it because they don't really like human beings. When they talk about favoring the environment, you have to ask yourself, favoring it from who? Who is the enemy of the environment in the minds of these environmentalists? It's us. And that's why they want to take as much land as possible and remove it from the possibility of private ownership and put it in government hands where at that point there's an army. I'm not kidding. It's a small army of heavily armed people. You try going in areas of even the national parks where they invite tourists and where they get some of the most revenue they get. And I'm going to talk about revenue on public lands in a minute. But they get most of the revenue there. You go away from the places that they let you go to, boy, you get arrested. They police the land from us. And that's the whole purpose of that. And the reality is, in the hands of the government, they spend so much money and they lose so much money from mismanagement, from fires. And of course, people's lives are lost in these things too. The damage that's done in California. Look at Pacific Palisades in California. The whole thing was leveled. And basically it was just total radical environmentalists running the city who permitted that to happen. And that's what happens in the case of all of these public lands. It's to varying degrees. It depends on where it is and who in particular is running it, if there's a confluence of factors making it even worse. In California, where you have a governor who basically, he's just a preening idiot who wants to please his very liberal base who support him financially. That's where he gets his money from, the most radical, very wealthy people. And he thinks he's going to be president because who else is running against him in the Democrat Party? But anyway, you have people like that running it and being in charge. People with no competence whatsoever at managing forests. He wouldn't know how to do it. It's just impossible. Any politician could know. And the people they choose to listen to are the people most hostile to preserving the forest. And in fact, what it is, they hate the idea of private companies making a profit. They think profit is evil. This is a central feature of Marxism, that profit is evil. Profit consists of stealing something, surplus value. That's what Karl Marx called it. It's unnecessary to the production. And it's with stealing from the customers, and when a profit is made per worker, that's the language of communists, where they're talking about people who are employees. Profit is made per employee in a company. That's exploiting the employees. The fact that their employees are there voluntarily and are happy to have the job, they don't care about that. But when the land management is always run by the most radical elements, because they're the ones who make the big fuss. Most people don't even think about public land management. It's the only people who even get involved in the process are these environmentalists. So it's a tiny group of people dedicated to Marxist principles, because the way Marxist principles are always promoted in the West, particularly in the United States, is through what are called front movements. What it is, they claim there's some issue that they promote, which provides them with moral superiority. It's a morally compelling thing that overwhelms all other considerations. In the case of environmentalism, supposedly the preservation of things as they are now, as if things ever remain the same, is such a moral imperative that it takes control. It deprives people of their own property rights. So that if somebody wants to do anything with his land, he's got to get the approval of all kinds of people in the government. And the expense of doing all that is so fantastic that Things like houses become more expensive. In California, where they've done this to the most radical extent, people can't afford to buy houses. I mean, a little, trash, junk, 2-bedroom place, it's $1 million if you can even find it. Because there's a shortage. They can't build because they have to jump through all those environmentalist hoops. But the environmentalists don't really protect the environment. The environment is this loosey-goosey concept. It's just used to attack private property rights. And that's what it's always been. Theodore Roosevelt, who was this environmentalist, wanted to have these national parks kept away from us, protected from us. He was a big snob. This was a guy who never had a real job in his life. He had his own uniform made by his tailor for the Rough Riders. He was into self-promotion. And he hated businessmen. He considered anyone who actually produced a product and got rich off of it. And of course, when people get rich off of producing something, it's because their buyers want to buy it. They're producing something of real value to other people. That's how people really get rich. They don't get rich from stealing it from the poor, which is this crazy notion that they see. That there's always being promoted by leftists. The math doesn't work. I mean, poor people, you can steal from them all you want. It's the old saying, you can't get blood from a turnip. But in any event, the way people really get rich in business is they come up with something that everybody wants, or a lot of people want, and are willing to pay for it. And then, of course, the company that they own the stock in, its value rises with the value of what they're producing. And that's how they get rich. That's how you get multi-billionaires like Elon Musk or Bill Gates when he was actually, when he did Microsoft. It's a business that is of enormous value to vast numbers of people. Anyway, communists look at everything from a lens of hatred of the human nature and hatred of human beings as we are. They don't want us to be rich. They consider getting rich evil. And when in fact, if you get rich in a free market, it's because you've provided something to other people. That's the only way you can really get rich. And because the laws of the market govern. And under the laws of the market, if you're not producing something that other people want, you go out of business. You can't trick people into buying something long enough to get away with it. Fraud can only go so far. And of course, the laws are very much created to prevent fraud, to discourage it by giving people the right to sue other people if they're defrauded. We don't need all these federal bureaucracies to protect us from that. That was a feature of the common law, which every state had when this country was formed. Anyway, this public ownership of land is an abomination. And by liquidating that, by having all of those public assets turned into private assets, it would then become real property. What it is, when the government owns land, it's a liability. And it's a liability for all of us. It happens that the federal lands, it's such a vast amount of land. It's 28% of the country. And it's so valuable that it generates money. So that even when you look at these billions of dollars of expenses they have every year, they do eke out a little profit. But if even a tiny percentage of that land was in private hands, the profits would be humongous. It's impossible to even calculate. What would the profitability, just as a tiny example, be of some developer who came up with a way of satisfying the demands of scenic easements to keep the place gorgeous, of, say, half the state of Utah? I mean, you could have all kinds of, it's beyond imagination, the various things that private people would come up with to use that land without harming its visual beauty, and in fact, glorying in the visual beauty. It's what gives it a huge amount of its value. And there's the old saying, no one ever washes a rented car. It's because they don't own it. The reason people wash their car and take care of their property is because they own it. They have a direct incentive to keep it healthy and free of damage, And that's what the real environmentalists want. They want land that isn't harming other people's land. But the radical environmentalists, you can just see it in what they do. One of their most popular acts is the Endangered Species Act. This is a really crazy piece of legislation they came up with in the 70s, under which various species are categorized. It's a view to basically taking evolution, which is an ongoing process. It's always, and species are always coming and going. It's been going on since the world began, since living creatures began to be here. And what the Endangered Species Act is, it envisions a world where none of that ever changes. There's some pristine Garden of Eden time that nobody can identify, where all the animals of the animal kingdom were there, and then they never die out. But it never happens. In real life, species really do die out, and they die out for all kinds of reasons, including that yes, maybe it's because of their interactions with us. But we have a right to be on the planet too, and that's something that the environmentalists do not agree with. They think the whole planet would be better off if we weren't here. That's what their real attitude is when they talk about environmentalism. It's environmentalism versus what? And if all of that land were converted into private ownership, that would be a way of liquidating the national debt. God only knows what it would be worth. It would have to be sold off in various ways. And the less public ownership of it there is, the better. Because the less government gets involved in dictating what happens to private property, the more value that property is. It's a zero-sum game. To the extent the government has power in dictating what happens to private property, it reduces the value of it. Just like to the extent the government has power over you, or the government has power, it's taken power from us. It gets all its power from us. Now, the Constitution is a contract between the citizens and the states. It's a completely unique document that only America has. And in it, the federal government is created, and they give it very specific powers. Very specific. They're all spelled out in Article 1, Section 8. Those are the powers that Congress has to legislate, which basically are the powers of the government. Because without the power to legislate, they can't do anything. Because it has to be legal, because we are a government of laws. That's why the powers of the government are in Article 2 of the Constitution, which is the article which creates and dictates the content and the activities of the legislative branch. Our government is divided into 3 branches. I mean, this is stuff they should teach in school, and some places I guess they do. We have the executive branch, which is just the president. The president is the executive branch. Now, there are people, obviously, who work under him, but he's the only one under the Constitution who actually has constitutional power. Other than the vice president only gets that kind of power, other than presiding over the Senate. That's the only thing the vice president actually can do while the president is satiate. Once the president dies or loses his marbles, basically there's nothing for the vice president structurally to do. The president can give jobs to do, which is what they do because they're a team. But that's simply the practical way it's done in our time. It wasn't always like that. There were times when you could have a vice president who wasn't even the same political party as the president. Early in the Republic, that could happen. But the executive branch is the president. And anyone who works in that branch is really only there because the president lets him. Now, there's all sorts of constraints on that Congress has built up over the years, completely unconstitutional. Basically, constraints on presidential power over the employees under his branch, preventing the president from using the executive branch to carry out his own policies, and he's the only one who's elected in that branch. Because in a republic, everything is always supposed to be ultimately responsible to the people. And when the president's the only one elected in the branch, other than the vice president who's on his team, that in a republic, he has to govern what happens under the powers of that branch. Just like in the legislative branch, there has to be majority rule in each house. with very few exceptions. Now, the Senate, of course, has completely destroyed that with the filibuster rule, where it requires a supermajority to pass anything. And that's why we have a messed up country right now, because there's no way to get rid of all the garbage that's been built up over a century. It really started in about 1906, the really bad stuff. Anyway, we've got all this public land. It's politically operated ultimately, and that political control is antithetical to the control of the market forces. When market forces govern, people are pleased. People buy and sell things according to their own choice, not because they have to, but because they want to. And ultimately, the real dichotomy is between collectivism and the liberty of the individual. Our Constitution is an inherently anti-collectivist document because it favors the liberty of the individual. And those three branches are set up the way they are, with power divided. Because, as James Madison said in the Federalist 47, quoting Montesquieu, when those powers are divided, the people can be free. But whenever those powers are united in a single individual or a group of people, say an agency, that is, in Madison's word, the very definition of tyranny. And it was that division of powers that was that's one of the things that are so critical in the Constitution. But the Constitution it could only operate if people respect it. One of the important things, the Constitution is a contract, and the founders intended to be enforced under the enforcement mechanism of contract law. That's exactly what they expected. They made it a contract under the common law. We, the people, they're actually signatories, and they signed, and they create this document with each of the three branches, with the powers and how people get elected, all described in there. And also, the states are forced to give up certain rights. The states agree to certain things, and everybody agrees that we would have a Republican form of government at every level. That means that the people would rule, that the majority rules. That's what a Republican form of government meant in that time. When you have all this land that's controlled by the government, nobody controls it except for politicians. And it's an inherently evil and dangerous thing. It's antithetical to the wealth of the nation because the wealth is kept locked up, and it can't be used except at the sufferance of the politicians. And of course, they prevent, if you get a Democrat administration, Joe Biden didn't want any of mining or drilling for oil and gas, nothing in the whole state of Alaska, even though nobody would see it except the bears. So, but he didn't care. He just didn't want anything done because he was supporting his left-wing Marxist environmentalist group. And that's what environmentalists always are. They are antithetical to the individual. They are opposed to individuals having property. They want the collective to have it. That's what government ownership means. And collectivism is always the opposite of individualism. And we live in a country with a Constitution dedicated to individual liberty. And when you have land owned or controlled by the government, that is a purely collectivist concept. It impoverishes us. Right now, if we don't sell that land, we've got real problems in terms of discharging that debt, because the public debt of $37 trillion, that's what they acknowledge. There's really a much bigger debt than that, which is the off-balance sheet stuff, the present value of the future liabilities for all the promises the government has made for Social Security, Medicare, welfare, all that stuff. And those liabilities overwhelm the publicly announced debt of $37 trillion. We have to sell that land to free ourselves and to enrich ourselves and to take power away from politicians. That's all the things that will happen if that's done. And the beauty will be preserved. It'll be even better. And there won't be as many forest fires. And people won't die in forest fires the way they do now. I'm Cliff Ribner, and I hope you like this video. And if you do, go to my website, cliffordribner.com, and go to my YouTube channel and read my book, Freedom's Last Stand. Thank you.